The first time he said, "I love you," I believed him so completely that my whole life started to rearrange itself around that three-word truth. His name was Noah, and he had a way of looking at me that felt like sunlight after months of rain. He was warm, quick to laugh, and he noticed the small things. The way I liked my coffee, that I kept a stack of old postcards in my nightstand. He showed up to my mundane days like an unexpected holiday. I was 26 and I'd been single for too long, tired of answers and people who could not be bothered to care. Noah cared. That was the promise I clung to. We moved fast in that gentle way two people do when both have been waiting. Within a year, we were sharing a tiny apartment with a balcony full of herbs, splitting chores, and trading secrets that felt like soft confessions. He read my favorite novels and made me playlists for rainy evenings. He told me he was proud of me when I finally left a job that had drained me. I felt seen in a way I hadn't before, and with feeling came trust. I stopped locking away parts of myself. I told him about the months I'd worked 2 jobs in college, about my fear of not being enough. He held me and said, "You are enough." There were cracks, not huge at first, just tiny hairlines you could ignore if you wanted. He was late to dinners, said he was caught in traffic. He said things like, "You're too sensitive," when I mentioned how hurtful certain comments were. At the time, I excused it. Everyone has flaws, I reasoned. Love is about forgiving small stuff. Then the betrayal arrived like a leak behind a wall, slow, damp, and finally visible. I found out about the other woman because of a message. Not a flirty text, something more sprawling and careless. Weekend plans, inside jokes, a photograph. It landed on my phone at 2 a.m. I remember the screen's light against the dark, and the way my breath left my lungs like a stolen thing. I didn't call him right away. I sat on the floor of our bedroom and let the world compress to the size of that tiny rectangle in my hand. I read the messages again and again until the words shifted from foreign letters to the anatomy of betrayal. It was not that he cheated once and confessed. It was that there were layers, weeks of meeting, casual calls in the middle of workdays, things arranged without my knowledge. The casual way he'd said, "I love you," began to sound like an actor reciting lines he'd memorized. When I confronted him, he laughed, not a nervous laugh, a laugh meant to deflect. "It's not what you think," he said. He told me the woman was a coworker who'd misread signals. He said it was over and they were just friends. His eyes never met mine long enough to tell me he was ashamed. The thing that hurt most wasn't his cheating. It was how little room he left in his story for the possibility that he had hurt me. I left our apartment that night. I took a bag and my dog-eared copy of the novel he'd once read to me in the kitchen under the hum of the refrigerator. I stayed with a friend who made me mint tea and let me speak until my voice sounded like a rope dragged over gravel. "You have to leave him," she said, and I knew she was right. But leaving isn't a single step. It's 1,000 small exits. It's canceling plans, changing passwords, creating new routines. The real blow came when the truth grew teeth. The woman messaged me directly in the crude way people do when they are sure of their power. She wrote, "We have something special, don't ruin it." I wrote back things I hardly recognized. Later, when I read my own messages, I realized my anger had matched her arrogance. She replied with a picture of her and Noah smiling. In the corner you could see a reflection. Me in the glass of a restaurant door, looking small. The rage was hot and immediate, but there was another thing beneath it, colder and steadier, humiliation. Humiliation is a slow burn because it burrows where pride used to sit. Friends said things like, "You deserve better," and that helped. But there was a voice in me that had not been raised to ask for better, because growing up I'd been taught that compromise was love and that sacrifice was proof of care. I'd built myself around the idea that my value was measured by what I gave away. At first I wanted to punish him. I imagined dramatic scenes, calling him out in front of his friends, posting pictures that exposed him. The idea felt satisfying in the small cinema of my mind. but when I let those fantasies play out to their ends, they looked hollow. He might be embarrassed, but embarrassment doesn't repair wounds. It makes a spectacle, yes, but it also makes me a spectacle. What I wanted, what I needed, was not to break him in the way he'd broken me. I wanted to break the part of me that believed my value was tied to his attentions. So I did the thing I'd been too scared to do for a long time. I said no to the scripts I had been handed. I removed myself from his orbit not with a spectacle, but with a plan to rebuild. The first days were terrible and honest. I wrote him a letter, not for him but for myself. I wrote all the small betrayals, all the times I'd softened and let things slide. I listed dates, facts, and the small triumphant acts he'd expected without reciprocation. My loans co-signed. My freelance work picked up in the gaps when his extra jobs left him flaky. The times I'd shown up to family dinners he missed. I read it out loud until the words lost their sting and became clear. I changed everything practical too. I called my bank, changed passwords, and made sure my accounts were secure. I blocked his number. I refused the temptation to look. In the quiet that followed, there was panic and also a strange kind of relief. The world felt bigger than the orbit I had been trapped in. What I didn't know in those first furious weeks was that my strategy for revenge would not be to humiliate him, but to make myself unignorable in ways that had nothing to do with shame. After the initial storm of leaving, I made a plan the way I'd prepared for an exam or a presentation, methodically and a little bit obsessively. I sat down with paper and a pen and wrote 2 lists. The first list was titled Repair and included things like therapy, savings, calling my mother back, seeing my doctor, and restructuring my work schedule. The second list was titled Build and included the things that had been shelved while I loved and caved and gave. Courses I wanted to take, a novel I'd started and never finished, the art classes I had promised myself after college. The repair items were urgent. The build items were my revenge. You can't rebuild a life without money, so I tightened my budget without panic. I sold things I didn't need and took on freelance clients again. The first check I earned by myself after leaving felt like owning a little patch of sky. I remember thinking, weirdly, of the loans I'd taken years ago to help my family, of the times I'd transferred money when they needed it and trusted they'd pay me back. It was a small, ironic pleasure to see my account grow from my own work. Therapy was harder than I expected. It was easy to say I'd go and then harder to excavate the parts of myself that had made me bend so willingly. My therapist, Leela, had a direct way of saying things that made me both angry and relieved. You learn to soothe your anxiety with caretaking, she said once, and then you mistook their dependence for love. It felt like a mirror. I had to admit that the patterns in my family taught me to give until I depleted. The work, ugly and necessary, was to learn to care for myself first. As the weeks passed, something else shifted. I started to tell the truth about my story in small, careful ways, not public declarations yet. I wrote a personal essay about heartbreak and dignity for a small online magazine that accepted first-person pieces. I wrote about the humiliation and the slow rebirth. I wrote about how the real wound was not infidelity alone, but the minimization of my pain. My essay was not a hit. It had a few shares, a handful of encouraging emails. But one of the emails surprised me. It was from a former colleague of Noah's who had worked with him at a mid-sized tech startup. She wrote, "Your essay, it's brave. If you ever want to talk, we should. I'm sorry this happened to you." She included details only someone close to him would know, a nickname he hated being called, a small lie about his resume. "I did something impulsive that day," I replied. "We arranged to meet for coffee." She told me about small things that didn't match the image he'd cultivated, a habit of claiming credit for other people's work, gaslighting colleagues during reviews, bending narratives to make himself look smarter. She said, "I left because of the pattern. You're brave for stepping out." It was not evidence of his infidelity, but it illustrated something more dangerous. He had a tendency to build an image of himself that was bigger than the truth, and he did it at other people's expense. My anger sharpened into focus. If he could make a career out of stealing light in the office, maybe it was time he felt the consequences of living a life built on borrowed shine. I was not a vindictive person by nature, but I was capable of strategy. I began documenting things, emails, timelines, instances where he'd claimed credit for my ideas in group chats, times he'd introduced stories about me that weren't true to mutual friends. Documentation is a dry, unemotional word for what it meant, reclaiming facts from a life that had been narrated by someone else. I reached out to people who had been quietly hurt, the colleague who'd shared details online, a friend who'd been brushed off by him at a party, even a neighbor who'd told me she'd seen him with the woman in the messages earlier than I'd suspected. I didn't plead. I asked questions and I listened. The pattern emerged like a map. There's a wrong idea about revenge that makes it messy and self-destructive, that to hurt someone in return, you must stoop to their level. I refused that. I wanted to expose the truth, but not by trading my dignity for spectacle. If I was going to damage his ego, it would be because I had real facts, things that mattered in the world he valued: work credibility, professional respect, the whispers in the offices where he wanted to be impressive. In other words, I wanted to leave fingerprints on his reputation in places where it would count. When it came time to act, I did what felt quiet and effective. I compiled the documentation and reached out to his company's HR department. I wrote a factual, precise email, dates, instances of misrepresentation, text threads where he took credit for work I'd done, and the way he'd used personal information to manipulate timelines. I attached screenshots and offered to speak in person. I didn't frame it as revenge. I framed it as disclosure, because someone else's behavior had consequences. HR response was quicker than I expected. They asked for more details and interviews. They were cautious, of course. Companies protect themselves, and allegations like this cannot be treated lightly. But the process set things in motion. Internal reviews were started. The woman he'd been seeing was interviewed. Managers who'd once dismissed the quiet complaints began to ask questions. I did not sit back and wait for the drama to unfold. I took other steps. I reconnected with the passions I had shelved. I decided to finish the novel I'd started years ago. I took a weekend writing workshop and learned how to hold scenes and breathe into sentences. Writing the novel wasn't directly revenge, but it was reclaiming time I'd lost. Each chapter I finished felt like an affirmation. I am more than a story someone else told about me. Every step felt like a brick laid back into my life. I took small professional risks, pitching ideas to publications, saying yes to presentations that terrified me, and pushing back at work meetings where my suggestions were initially ignored. The thing about confidence is that it's cumulative. One small success helps you walk through the next closed door. Word from HR was slow and then clear. Investigations revealed that Noah had misrepresented his role on several projects, claimed other people's work as his own on performance reviews, and kept an unhealthy pattern of manipulating colleagues. The company placed him on leave pending further action. I did not post about it. I did not gloat. I filed the documents I had submitted and kept going. Then came the day his work email bounced. Rumors spread, quiet layoffs, whispers that the man who'd told half the office he was indispensable had overplayed his hand. He was suspended and later let go. I heard it through the grapevine, through the small digital currents of people who knew both of us. When someone I'd barely known texted, "He's gone," I felt an odd flinch. I had not wanted to ruin him. I had wanted truth. But truth had consequences. There were people who called me cold. You can't control what others will say when they watch the arc of another's downfall. Some people mistook my dignity for cruelty. It hurt, but it also taught me something. You cannot live for other people's judgments and make the brave choices you must. If I had to be misread, I would rather be misunderstood than live as diminished. As the months unfolded, I noticed that my life began to rearrange itself in hopeful ways. I published another piece about rebuilding after betrayal. This one went bigger, capturing an audience of readers who wrote back to say their lives had been similar in beautiful, heartbreaking ways. One woman wrote, "I finally left him last year because of your first piece. Thank you for giving me language." Those messages landed in me like seeds. Each one was a reason to keep building. Noah reached out once, months after the company had let him go. He wanted to meet to talk, he wrote. I read his message twice before replying. The part of me that remembered the warmth wanted to forgive with a simplicity that would have erased learning. But forgiveness without accountability is not healing. I wrote back to say I had moved on and wished him well. I did not tell him how he had dismantled my trust or how long it took to sleep without waking at 3 a.m. I kept it short, like a clean curtain pulled across an open window. Months after that text, I was invited to speak at a conference on workplace ethics. The irony was not lost on me, standing on a stage years later to speak about integrity when my last intimate relationship had been assaulted by its absence. I told my story plainly, focusing on patterns rather than personalities, the small manipulations, the way charm can function as camouflage, the harm of stealing narrative from others. I spoke about the difference between public humiliation and accountable consequences. The applause was real, but the real reward came later that week, in emails from women and men who said they had witnessed similar behaviors and now felt empowered to act. I finished my novel in the middle of an autumn that smelled like wet leaves and coffee. It was not a bestseller. It was a small, stubborn victory. I printed the first hard copy and sat in my kitchen and read the last page until the words blurred. When I set the book down, something inside me felt like it had finally arrived. The woman who had once measured herself by the gentleness of others had learned to measure herself by the quietness of her own convictions. I started dating again, not recklessly, not flinging myself into the arms of the first person who said the right things, but slowly. There was a young man I met at a gallery opening who was kind in the ways people often claim but rarely show. He asked questions about my work and remembered the little details weeks later. He did not rush me, and that felt like a blessing. I recognized the difference between presence and performance, between attention and acclaim. One morning, as we sat on my balcony drinking coffee, Noah's name crossed my mind, like a cloud passing by a bright sun. The thought came without sting. He had been a chapter, not the entire book. I no longer felt compelled to re-examine every page to learn what I could have done differently. That old reflex self-scrutiny as punishment had faded. The most surprising part of my healing was how it changed the way I treated other people. In the months after I took space and built things, I became more attentive in the small ways that actually matter. Returning calls, showing up at friends' events, sending messages that said, "I'm here." It's a strange kind of revenge to become the person you were meant to be. People noticed. They told me I was radiant. I smiled and thought, maybe this is what radiance looks like, unborrowed and honest. Sometimes my sister calls unexpectedly. We talk about trivialities, recipes, a show she's binging. We don't always talk about the past, and when we do, it's careful and measured. She told me once, apologetically, I didn't realize how much he was manipulating people. Her voice was full of regret, and I said things I now believed. You didn't know. It's not on you to have known everything. Forgiveness here is a slow education. Maybe one day she'll understand fully. Maybe she won't. That is outside my control. One winter evening, I received a message from a woman who had been in a relationship with Noah after me. She had read my essay and sent a long note about how it mirrored her experience. We arranged to meet for tea. She told me things that confirmed the pattern, and together we laughed, brittle at first, then soft at the edges, about the absurdity of how he'd constructed himself. In that small shared space, there was no triumph, only mutual recognition and the ability to call things by their names. The best revenge, it turned out, was quiet and cumulative. It was finishing that novel. It was standing on stage and speaking truth without bitterness. It was the emails I received from strangers thanking me for a sentence that gave them courage. It was paying off small debts, traveling to places I'd only dreamed of, and learning to sleep again. People sometimes asked me if I felt bad about the way things had played out professionally for Noah. I was honest. Sometimes I felt a twinge of discomfort, but what outweighed it was a sense of moral equilibrium. He had made choices, they had consequences. My role was not to become the arbiter of his fate, but to insist that truth take its place in the world. Accountability is not vengeance's twin, it is its necessary balancing act. Years later, over coffee with a friend who had also been hurt by someone she loved, I said, "You don't have to make them small to feel large. You can simply grow." She nodded slowly, and I could see in her the same slow shift I had known, like a bud finally deciding to open. There are still nights when I wake brief and breathless, memories sharp as new paper. I sit up, turn on the lamp, and breathe through it. Then I remind myself of the lists, the repair list and the build list. I bring myself back to the things that sustained me, not revenge as a project, but growth as a practice. He broke my heart, and it took a season for that break to be something other than a wound. I rebuilt. I set boundaries. I learned the delicious and terrifying joy of being the author of my own life again. In doing so, I didn't only break his ego, I healed the part of me that had let anyone measure my worth. If you asked me now what revenge felt like, I would speak plainly. It wasn't about him at all. It was about respect. It was the slow, beautiful accumulation of choices that protected my dignity. It was finishing the things I had left unfinished, speaking my truth and allowing the world to see me without apology. When people say she got her revenge, they often imagine a scene of dramatic humiliation. What I did was quieter. I repaired, I built, and I kept my hands clean. I didn't seek revenge like a fist. I sought it like a reclaiming of territory that was always mine. He lost his illusions of grandeur, and I regained what belongs to every human being, a life lived on one's own terms. At the end of it all, standing on a small balcony in the city where I had once felt small, with a novel finished on my shelf and friends around me who loved me for who I was rather than what I provided, I understood this. The most powerful answer to anyone who doubts your worth is to become unmistakably yourself. That, more than any spectacle, is the best kind of breaking. They tell me I'm brave for what I did. I don't always feel brave. I feel stubborn and a little tired, and sometimes I still ache. But I also feel whole in ways I never had been when I defined myself by his light. He broke my heart, yes. I took the pieces and used them to build something I could survive inside. I didn't only break his ego, I rewired my life. That is my revenge, and it tastes quietly like peace.